A kitten keeps following a policeman for blocks, never leaving his side. At first he thinks it's just another stray, but when he looks closer, he notices something isn't right. The tiny cat's behavior is too deliberate, too desperate. What he discovers next will change both their lives forever. Who sent this determined little messenger? What urgent secret is it trying to share? And why won't this tiny kitten give up? Before we get into this incredible story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Rain poured down on the dimly lit streets of downtown Chicago, turning the city into a maze of reflective puddles and shadowy corners. Officer Mike Sullivan pulled his patrol car into the station's parking lot, his 12-hour shift finally coming to an end. The late October wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Before we continue with this incredible story, take a moment to share in the comments where you're watching from today. From the busy streets of New York to the quiet towns of Australia, our community spans the globe, and we'd love to know which corner of the world you call home. As Mike gathered his belongings, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror, a tiny movement in the darkness behind his car. He squinted through the rain-streaked glass, catching a glimpse of what looked like a small orange ball of fur. A kitten barely bigger than his hand sat huddled against the rear tire, its fur matted and dripping from the relentless downpour. "Go on, get somewhere dry," Mike called out, waving his hand dismissively. The kitten didn't move. Its large green eyes stayed fixed on him with an intensity that seemed almost human. There was something different about this look, not the usual hungry stare of a stray, but something more desperate. Mike sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. 23 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this situation felt off. He stepped out of the car, the cold rain immediately soaking through his uniform. The kitten remained still, watching his every move. As he approached, the tiny creature stood up on shaky legs. Instead of running away, it took a tentative step toward him, letting out a meow that was barely audible over the storm. Up close, Mike could see how young it was, probably no more than a few months old. Its orange fur was dirty and tangled, but what struck him most were the scratches on its face and paws, fresh wounds that spoke of recent trouble. "You're in a bit of a mess, aren't you?" Mike knelt down, extending his hand slowly. The kitten flinched but held its ground, that same urgent look in its eyes. When Mike's fingers brushed against its wet fur, he felt how badly it was trembling, from cold, fear, or both. Just then, his radio crackled to life. "All units, be advised. We have reports of suspicious activity at 1247 Maple Street. Possible breaking and entering in progress." Mike straightened up, duty calling. The kitten immediately tensed, letting out another desperate meow. As he turned to get back in his car, it darted forward, weaving between his feet with surprising agility for its weakened state. "I can't help you right now," Mike said firmly, gently nudging the kitten aside with his boot. "There's a shelter 3 blocks down. Go there." But as he drove toward Maple Street, lights flashing through the rain, he couldn't shake the image of those pleading green eyes from his mind. Something wasn't right. In all his years patrolling these streets, he'd never seen a stray act quite like this. The breaking and entering call turned out to be a false alarm, just a teenager who'd forgotten his house key. As Mike headed back to the station, he found himself taking the long route, eyes scanning the rain-slicked streets for any sign of orange fur. He told himself he was being ridiculous. This city had hundreds of stray cats. This one was no different. Yet when he pulled back into the station parking lot an hour later, there it was, in the exact same spot, still waiting. The rain had gotten worse, turning the parking lot into a small lake, but the kitten hadn't moved. If anything, it seemed even more determined, rising to its feet the moment it spotted his car. This time, when Mike stepped out, the kitten ran straight to him. It pawed at his pant leg, meowing with increased urgency. When he didn't immediately respond, it ran a few feet away, stopped, and looked back at him expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Mike asked incredulously. The kitten meowed again, taking another few steps and waiting, There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't random behavior. This kitten was trying to lead him somewhere. Mike checked his watch. His shift had ended hours ago. He should be heading home to his empty apartment, to the leftover pizza and late-night TV shows that had become his routine since Sarah passed away last year. Instead, he found himself standing in the pouring rain, considering whether to follow a stray kitten into the night. The kitten meowed again, more insistently this time. Something in that sound, a mix of desperation and determination, made Mike's decision for him. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most important moments of a cop's career came not from following protocol, but from following instinct. All right, he sighed, already knowing he might regret this. Show me what's so important. The kitten immediately perked up, its tail lifting slightly for the first time since he'd seen it. As Mike followed the tiny orange figure through the rain-soaked streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to stumble onto something much bigger than a lost kitten. Something that would change more lives than he could imagine, including his own. The kitten moved with surprising purpose through the rain-slicked streets, stopping every few feet to ensure Mike was still following. Despite its small size and obvious exhaustion, it pressed forward with a determination that made Mike increasingly uneasy. Whatever was driving this tiny creature had to be serious. They passed through familiar neighborhoods that looked different in the dead of night. Closed storefronts cast eerie shadows, their darkened windows reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. The rain had finally begun to ease, but the October wind still cut through Mike's wet uniform, chilling him to the bone. After about 15 minutes of walking, the kitten suddenly froze. Its ears perked up, and its whole body tensed. Before Mike could react, it darted into a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings. By the time he reached the entrance, the kitten had vanished. "Great," Mike muttered, pulling out his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing overflowing dumpsters and years of accumulated debris. He was about to turn back when he heard it, a faint meow echoing from deeper in the alley. Following the sound, Mike picked his way carefully through the urban maze. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thick with the smell of rotting garbage and stagnant water. His instincts screamed that this was exactly the kind of place where ambushes happened. How many times had he warned citizens about following strange sounds into dark alleys? Another meow, closer this time. Mike's flashlight beam caught a flash of orange fur disappearing through a hole in a chain-link fence. The gap was barely big enough for him to squeeze through, and as he did, the rough metal snagged his uniform. On the other side, Mike found himself in what must have once been a loading dock for an old warehouse. Broken pallets and rusted machinery created an obstacle course of shadows. The kitten sat in the middle of the space, watching him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. But something was wrong. The kitten's posture had changed. Its ears were flat against its head, and its tail puffed up to twice its size. A low growl rumbled from its tiny chest, but it wasn't directed at Mike. It was looking at something behind him. Mike spun around, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. The flashlight beam revealed nothing but empty space and dancing shadows. Yet the kitten's growl intensified, and Mike could feel it too now, that prickle on the back of his neck that told him they weren't alone. A sudden crash of metal on concrete made him jump. Something had knocked over a stack of old pipes behind one of the dumpsters. Mike's heart pounded as he edged closer, one hand on his gun, the other keeping the flashlight steady. The beam illuminated a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness, much larger than the kitten's, and filled with a very different kind of intelligence. A man crouched in the shadows, his face obscured by a dirty hoodie. Before Mike could say anything, the figure bolted, scaling the fence with practiced ease and disappearing into the night. Mike considered pursuing but quickly decided against it. He was off duty, out of his jurisdiction, and had no probable cause. Besides, something told him the man wasn't what the kitten had been trying to show him. Speaking of which, Mike turned back to find the tiny orange cat sitting exactly where he'd left it, but its demeanor had changed again. The fear was gone, replaced by that same urgent look from before. It meowed once softly, then trotted toward a rusted door set into the warehouse wall. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Dark stains that looked disturbingly like blood marked the concrete around it. The kitten stopped at the threshold, looking back at Mike with an expression that clearly said, "This is it." Mike hesitated. He should call this in, wait for backup. Following strange cats into dark alleys was bad enough. Entering abandoned buildings alone was just asking for trouble. But something in the kitten's eyes told him there wasn't time for protocol. Drawing his weapon, Mike pushed the door open wider. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. As his flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside, the kitten darted between his legs, disappearing into the gloom. "This is the police!" Mike called out, his voice bouncing off the bare walls. "Anyone here?" The only response was the distant drip of water and the fading echo of his own words. But as he stepped further into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight revealed something that made his blood run cold. There, in the corner of the vast space, was a makeshift living area. Dirty blankets, empty food containers, and what looked like medical supplies scattered across the floor. And in the center of it all, barely visible in the dim light, was a small bundle wrapped in a blood-stained sheet. It wasn't moving. The kitten sat beside the bundle, looking up at Mike with those knowing green eyes. And in that moment, he understood why this tiny creature had been so desperate to find help. What he didn't know yet was that this discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would uncover one of the city's darkest secrets and change countless lives forever. Mike's hands trembled slightly as he knelt beside the bundle, the flashlight beam revealing more details he wasn't sure he wanted to see. The sheet was dirty and worn, with dark stains that looked far too fresh. His heart pounded as he reached out to pull back one corner of the fabric. The kitten watched intently, its tiny body pressed against Mike's leg as if offering support. As the sheet fell away, Mike's breath caught in his throat. Inside was a young woman, probably no more than 20, her face pale and drawn with pain. But she was breathing, shallow, rapid breaths that showed she was alive. "Miss, can you hear me?" Mike gently touched her shoulder. Her skin felt hot even through the thin material of her shirt. Fever. Her arms were marked with needle tracks, telling a story Mike had seen too many times in his years on the force. But something was different here. Mixed in with the track marks were surgical scars, precise and deliberate, nothing like the messy marks of street drug use. The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with fever. "They're coming back," she whispered, her voice hoarse and frightened. "Don't let them take any more." Before Mike could ask what she meant, her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. He immediately grabbed his radio, calling for emergency medical services and backup. As he rattled off the address, his flashlight beam caught something that made him pause. A tattoo on the woman's wrist, partially obscured by dirt and blood. It wasn't the usual street art or gang symbol. It looked more like a serial number. The kitten suddenly tensed, its fur standing on end. Mike heard it too, footsteps approaching from outside, multiple sets moving with purpose. He positioned himself between the unconscious woman and the door, drawing his weapon. The kitten darted behind a stack of crates, but its eyes remained fixed on the entrance. Two figures appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from outside. They wore what looked like medical scrubs under dark jackets, and they moved with the confidence of people who thought they owned the place. When they saw Mike, they froze. "Police, don't move!" Mike's voice echoed through the warehouse. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then everything happened at once. One of the figures reached into his jacket. Mike saw the glint of metal. "Gun!" he shouted, diving for cover as the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash momentarily lighting up the warehouse like lightning. Mike returned fire, aiming low, trying to disable rather than kill. His first shot caught one of the attackers in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. The second man turned to run, only to trip over something small and orange that darted between his feet. The kitten's unexpected intervention gave Mike the opening he needed. "Stay down! Hands where I can see them." This time they complied. As Mike moved to secure the suspects, he could hear sirens in the distance. growing closer. The kitten emerged from its hiding place, looking supremely satisfied with itself as it walked over to check on the unconscious woman. What followed was a blur of activity. Paramedics arrived first, quickly moving the woman to an ambulance. Police units swarmed the scene, securing evidence and taking statements. Crime scene technicians photographed everything, paying special attention to a collection of medical equipment found hidden behind some old machinery, equipment that had no business being in an abandoned warehouse. As dawn broke over the city, Mike sat in his captain's office, the kitten curled up in his lap. He'd tried to hand it over to animal control, but it had somehow managed to find its way back to the station. Now, as he gave his report, the pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture more horrifying than anything he'd imagined. The woman was one of 12 reported missing over the past 6 months. All young, all vulnerable, all disappearing from different parts of the city. The 2 men in custody were part of something bigger, an underground medical operation that made money harvesting and selling organs on the black market. They preyed on drug addicts and homeless people, using their addictions to manipulate them, keeping them alive only as long as they were useful. "The DA wants to talk to you first thing tomorrow," the captain said, his face grim. "This could be the biggest case this department has seen in years. Those bastards have connections all over the city, politicians, business leaders, maybe even some of our own." Mike nodded, absently stroking the kitten's fur. It had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from its night of heroics. "How long do you think this has been going on?" The captain shook his head. "Hard to say, but thanks to your little friend here, it stops now." He nodded toward the sleeping kitten. "Speaking of which, what are you going to do with it?" Mike looked down at the tiny orange creature that had led him to this discovery. Its work wasn't done yet. There were still more victims to find, more lives to save. Somehow, this kitten had known exactly who to ask for help, and it had refused to give up until justice was served. "I think," Mike said slowly, "we might have just found ourselves a new member of the force." The captain smiled. "Well, every good detective needs a partner." His expression turned serious again. "You know this isn't over, right? Those men we caught, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Their bosses won't take this lying down." Mike's jaw set with determination. "Let them come, we'll be ready." The kitten stirred in his lap, opening one eye as if to say, "You bet we will." What had started as a routine end to a shift had become the beginning of something much bigger. There were more mysteries to solve, more lives to save, and more justice to be served. And somehow, Mike knew that this brave little kitten would be right there beside him every step of the way. T5E hospital corridors seemed endless as Mike made his way to the ICU, the kitten hidden inside his jacket. He'd had to smuggle it in, against regulations, but something told him their rescued victim needed to see her tiny savior. The woman, now identified as Jessica Martinez, had been in and out of consciousness for 3 days, her body fighting off infection from poorly performed surgical procedures. As Mike entered her room, the steady beep of medical monitors filled the air. Jessica looked small and fragile against the white hospital sheets, but some color had returned to her face. Her eyes opened as he approached, widening slightly when she saw who it was. "Officer Sullivan," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in the warehouse. Then she noticed the movement under his jacket, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. "You found Tiger." Mike blinked in surprise as he carefully took the kitten out. "Tiger, is this your cat?" Jessica shook her head weakly. "Not mine. She belonged to Anna." Her eyes filled with tears. "Anna was there before me. She didn't make it through their last procedure. But Tiger never left. She watched over all of us, somehow always knowing when they were coming back. She'd warn us, try to distract them when they were hurting us." The kitten, Tiger, jumped onto the bed with surprising gentleness, curling up next to Jessica's hand. Mike pulled up a chair, taking out his notebook. "Jessica, I know this is hard, but we need to find the others. How many were there?" 5 when I was there." Jessica's fingers trembled as they stroked Tiger's fur. "They move us around, though. different warehouses, different operating rooms. She spat the last words with disgust. They call themselves the Foundation, say they're doing important medical research, helping people who can't get organs through normal channels, but really they're just monsters. Mike leaned forward. Do you remember any names, faces? They wore masks during procedures, but there was one. They called him the Doctor. He had a scar here. She traced a line across her left eyebrow. He likes to talk while he works, like he's teaching. Said something once about a clinic on Marshall Street. Mike's hand tightened on his notebook. Marshall Street was in one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods, home to several prestigious private medical practices. The pieces were starting to fit together. How the operation had stayed hidden so long, why the equipment was so professional. A nurse appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry, officer, but Ms. Martinez needs her rest. As Mike stood to leave, Jessica grabbed his sleeve. Don't let them get away with this, she pleaded. And take care of Tiger. She's a hero. Back at the station, Mike spread photos across his desk. Surveillance shots from Marshall Street, medical supply shipping records, missing persons reports. Tiger sat in the middle of it all, occasionally pawing at certain pictures as if she recognized them. The clinic belongs to Dr. Victor Reynolds, Detective Sarah Chen said, dropping another file on Mike's desk. Prestigious surgeon, major political donor, pillars of the community type. But look at this. She pointed to a series of financial records. Large cash deposits every month, always just under reporting limits. And these shipping manifests. Way more surgical supplies than a small private practice would need. Mike studied the doctor's photo. There it was, a thin scar crossing his left eyebrow. We need proof that connects him directly to the warehouses. Documents, witnesses, anything. That's the problem, Sarah sighed. Nobody's talking. The two guys you caught, found dead in their cells this morning, made to look like suicide. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. How far up did this really go? Tiger suddenly perked up, staring intently at his computer screen. She pawed at a minimized window, the floor plans for Reynolds' clinic they'd pulled from city records. Mike enlarged the image, and Tiger became extremely agitated, pawing at a specific area of the basement. Sarah leaned in closer. What's she trying to tell us? Mike remembered Jessica's words about Tiger warning them, watching over them. She knows something. The clinic. There must be something in the basement. A connection to the warehouses, maybe, or... His blood ran cold as the realization hit him. Or another operating room. They're not just using the warehouses. The clinic itself. He couldn't finish the thought. Sarah was already reaching for her phone. I'll get a warrant. But Mike... She glanced around the busy office, lowering her voice. Be careful who you trust with this. If Reynolds has the connections we think he does. Mike nodded grimly. He'd been a cop long enough to know how these things worked. Money meant influence, and influence meant protection. But as he looked down at Tiger, still intently studying the floor plans, he felt a surge of determination. This little cat had risked everything to save lives and expose the truth. He owed it to her, and to all the victims, to see this through, no matter the cost. What he didn't know was that within the next 24 hours, everything would come to a head in a confrontation that would test them both to their limits. The truth was even darker than they imagined, and some people would stop at nothing to keep it buried. The night air felt electric as Mike parked his unmarked car a block from Reynolds' clinic. Tiger sat in the passenger seat, her green eyes fixed on the building's dark silhouette against the city skyline. The warrant had come through, but something felt wrong. The clinic's windows were completely dark. No security lights, no cleaning crew, nothing. I don't like this, Sarah muttered from the back seat, checking her weapon for the third time. They'd kept the raid team small, just 4 trusted officers. The fewer people involved, the less chance of a leak. But now, staring at the silent building, Mike wondered if they'd made a mistake. Tiger suddenly went rigid, her fur standing on end. Seconds later, they saw it, a large moving truck backing up to the clinic's service entrance. Men in medical scrubs began quickly loading equipment into it. They knew we were coming, Mike growled, reaching for his radio. All units move in now. What followed was chaos. The suspects scattered as police cars converged on the clinic, their sirens piercing the night. Mike and Sarah sprinted toward the service entrance, Tiger somehow keeping pace despite her tiny size. Inside, they found clear signs of a hasty evacuation. Papers scattered everywhere, computers still running, drawers left open. Check the basement, Mike ordered the other officers. There might still be victims down there. He and Sarah headed for the main office, following Tiger's determined lead. The kitten seemed to know exactly where she was going, darting down corridors with unwavering purpose. They found Dr. Reynolds in his private office, deliberately feeding documents into a shredder. He looked up as they burst in, and Mike finally saw the man behind the prestigious facade. The doctor's face was twisted with cold fury, the scar above his eyebrow standing out against his pale skin. "Officer Sullivan," Reynolds said smoothly, stepping away from the shredder. "I assume you have a warrant?" "On your knees, hands behind your head," Mike ordered, weapon trained on the doctor, but Reynolds didn't move. "Do you really think it ends with me?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea how many powerful people depend on our services? How much money is involved?" "You mean how many people benefit from your torture and murder?" Sarah's voice shook with barely controlled rage. Reynolds smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We're saving lives, officer. The people we use, they're nothing. Street trash, addicts. No one misses them. But our clients, they're important people, people who contribute to society." Tiger growled, a sound far bigger than her small body should have been able to produce. Reynolds glanced down at her, and for the first time, his composure cracked. "That damn cat," he snarled. "Should have killed it when it first showed up." He moved with surprising speed, reaching for something under his desk. "Gun!" Sarah shouted, but Tiger was faster. She launched herself at Reynolds' face, claws extended. The doctor screamed, stumbling backward. The gun went flying from his hand, skittering across the floor. Mike tackled Reynolds as Sarah secured the weapon. As he handcuffed the struggling doctor, they heard shouts from the basement. "Up here! We need medics! We found them!" Hours later, Mike sat in his captain's office again, Tiger curled in his lap. The raid had rescued 7 victims from a hidden surgical suite in the clinic's basement. Documents recovered from Reynolds' office, along with testimonies from the survivors, had exposed a network that reached into the highest levels of city government. "The FBI's taking over the case," the captain said, looking exhausted but satisfied. "This is bigger than we imagined. Similar operations in 3 other cities, all connected. Reynolds was just one part of it." "And the victims?" Mike asked, thinking of Jessica in her hospital bed. "All getting proper medical care now. The DA's office is working on witness protection for those willing to testify." The captain smiled slightly. "Several of them asked about the cat, you know. Said she was their guardian angel in that hell." Mike looked down at Tiger, who was purring contentedly. This tiny creature had shown more courage and determination than many humans he knew. She'd never given up, never stopped fighting for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. "The press is going to want to talk to you," the captain continued. "This is going to be a big story. Hero cop and his crime-fighting cat take down major organ trafficking ring." Mike shook his head. "Tiger's the real hero. I was just the backup." Later that evening, Mike unlocked his apartment door, Tiger trotting in ahead of him like she'd lived there all along. He'd stopped by the pet store on the way home, loading up on everything a cat might need: food, litter box, toys, a soft bed. Though somehow he suspected Tiger would prefer sleeping on his pillow. As he watched her explore her new home, Mike thought about everything that had led to this moment. One small cat had exposed a massive criminal enterprise, saved countless lives, and in the process had given him something he'd been missing since Sarah died: a purpose, a partner, a family. Tiger jumped onto the couch and looked at him expectantly, patting the cushion beside her with one paw. Mike smiled and sat down, scratching behind her ears as she purred. Outside, the city was still full of darkness and secrets, but they would face them together. After all, every good cop needed a partner they could trust, even if that partner happened to be a tiny orange kitten with the heart of a lion. The next morning's newspaper headline would read, "Hero Cat Helps Police Bust Organ Trafficking Ring." But for Mike and Tiger, it wasn't about the headlines or the accolades. It was about justice, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And as they settled into their new routine, both knew this was just the beginning of their adventures together.